Good evening to all of you. My name is Molly Marshall. Welcome to United. Tonight, we have alums, friends, donors, new friends, faculty, students, and our far-flung alums. If you would not mind, please drop your name into the chat so that we'll have a sense of who is in the Zoom room together. I'm so grateful we're able to gather in this way. Our favorite faculty lecture series has been quite the hit this fall and now this spring. It's a time when we invite our faculty to do what they do best, and that is to offer insights from their scholarship, their wisdom, and their particular passion. To ask a faculty member to give a favorite lecture, is a dangerous thing because it could go on and on. Our hope is that you will have a chance tonight to see the breadth and the wonder of the educational experience at United. Wonderful things happen in the classroom here, and you will get to be a student of Dr. Jessica Chapman Lape this evening. Now it is my privilege to call on Robert Monson in the Zoom room, who is a current student, MA student doing an independent study concentration, and he will introduce Dr. Chapman Lape.
Hello, everyone. It is good to be with you all. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Chapman Lape to you all tonight. And I had the privilege of taking her pastoral and spiritual care class last year, and it was good. Yes, the content was good. Yes, the guest speakers were amazing. But for me, Dr. Chapman Lape facilitated an environment where I could learn to listen to myself and the genuine and the divine within myself and within others well. And she really produced that environment where learning could happen, co-created with others. I will always be grateful to her for that and how she tended to our curiosity in that space well. So welcome, Dr. Chapman Lape, and thank you for all that you have done for us as students.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for that introduction and for all that you have done for me and the wisdom that you've imparted in our classrooms. And thank you to President Marshall for your extending a warm welcome this evening. And thank you to Cindy Beth Johnson, who is the mastermind behind this wonderful idea of a favorite faculty lecture series. Cindy Beth, when you approached me with this opportunity, you really encouraged me to use my own voice in this lecture and integrate my womanist work, and I appreciate that. Thank you also to Andrew Fox, working behind the scenes, and to Michael Mua for your technological genius. And finally, thank you to all my faculty colleagues who gave their lectures before me. You all model phenomenal theological scholarship, and I'm just grateful to learn from you and to be in your midst. So when my colleague, Dr. Gary Green, provided his lecture now quite a few weeks ago, he made mention of the complex tradition and politics of lecturing as a means of education, and I share his sentiment. If you were to ask my students, I think they would affirm that I prefer to hold conversation and facilitate a collaborative learning space over and above the method of lecturing. And I also believe that facilitating collaborative learning spaces, or honoring the genius in the room, as my professor, Dr. Nicholas Greer, would say, is more of a womanist scholarly practice than that of the lecture. And so I hope our time together feels more in line with a conversation where, of course, I will be doing most of the talking, but I invite you to actively respond, whether in the chat or within your own imagination, with your questions, with your thoughts, and with your perspectives, for that is the womanist way. And tonight, we are taking a journey into womanist work. I will also name that I am an African-American woman whose ancestry flows deep below the Mason-Dixon line into Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee. I therefore feel only equipped to speak about the African-American experience in our conversation today, although I acknowledge the vast diasporic voices that have contributed to womanist pastoral theology. And by using the term African-American women, I am referring to all women, trans women whose ancestors' African diasporic journeys brought them to the United States of America, often by way of the transatlantic slave trade. So the topic of our conversation this evening is flourishing in the clearing, womanist approaches to spiritual care. And here I invite us to consider what it might look like for womanist spiritual caregivers to create, co-create, and facilitate spaces of healing, self-love, community, and ultimately flourishing for African-American women in the midst of a society that is committed to our suffering. But as we begin, I'd like to take a step back and define the term womanist, offer a bit of background on womanist religious scholarship, and provide some insight into womanist pastoral theology. So what does it mean to be a womanist? Hear these words from Alice Walker. Womanist, 1. From womanish, opposite of girlish, i.e. frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. A Black feminist or feminist of color. From the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you actin' womanish, i.e. like a woman, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior, wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. Interested in grown-up doings, acting grown-up, being grown-up, interchangeable with another Black folk expression, he's trying to be grown. Responsible, in charge, serious. 2, also, a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, values tears as a natural counterbalance of laughter, and women's strength. Sometimes loves individual men sexually and or non-sexually, committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female. Not a separatist, except periodically for health. Traditionally universalist, as in, Mama, why are we brown, pink, and yellow, and our cousins are white, beige, and Black? Answer, well, you know, the colored race is just like a flower garden, with every color flower represented. Traditionally capable, as in, Mama, I'm walking to Canada and I'm taking you and a bunch of other slaves with me. Reply, it wouldn't be the first time. 3, loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself, regardless. 4, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. Alice Walker's definition of a womanist beautifully encompasses both the power and potential of Black women naming, claiming, and identifying themselves. The beauty, power, strength, and acceptance the term encapsulates has been passed down like old family recipes, a thread of legacy sewn throughout the lives of African-American women in diaspora. Walker first used the term womanist in her short story, Coming Apart, published in 1979. However, Walker's definition of womanist debuted in her work, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which is a compilation of Walker's original essays that shed light on her lived experience and bears witness to the everyday struggles and joys of a Black woman in America. During the time of Walker's publication of the early 1980s, there were also shifts occurring within academic religious scholarship. African-American women offered their voices, curricula, and texts to the worlds of theological education, but their work was often relegated to the basement of the ivory tower. Therefore, African-American women religious scholars began to name and claim their work for themselves. Despite Walker's work originating as narrative prose, Black women religious scholars appropriated Walker's womanism in order to finally possess language wide enough and deep enough and bold enough to describe the work of African-American religious scholarship. Thus, the field of womanist theology was birthed from the pages of Alice Walker and midwifed by African-American women religious scholars, focused on creating a legacy for future generations. And as all theologies mold and transform over time, womanist theology is no different. Subspecialties in ethics, biblical studies, Christology, and process studies emerge, urging the academy to both recognize and publish womanist theologians whose scholarship advanced their respective fields. So enters womanist pastoral theology. Womanist pastoral theology takes seriously the call for Black women pastoral and spiritual caregivers to provide both theoretical and practical frameworks for caring for Black women. Womanist pastoral theologians stand at the intersection of womanism and pastoral care to create a field focused on the flourishing of African-American women and their families, often embracing subversive images, methods, and practices of pastoral care. A benchmark of womanist pastoral theology is its recognition of the limitations of traditional pastoral care paradigms rooted in white male Western Christian values. For instance, womanist pastoral theologians Marsha Wiggins and Karma Braun Williams write that, quote, in general, clergy and others who provide pastoral care are focused largely on individual need rather than on social realities, on personal pain rather than corporate suffering, end quote. Likewise, womanist pastoral theologian Carol Watkins Ali resists pastoral theologian Seawood Hiltner's traditional white male Protestant paradigm of pastoral care that is healing, sustaining, and guiding, which is the paradigm still often taught in intro to pastoral care courses around the country. And instead, Watkins Ali embraces a paradigm centered around nurturing, empowering, liberating, and reconciling, all methods rooted in the cultural healing practices of African-American communities and proven beneficial in the spiritual care of African-American women in particular. Another benchmark in womanist pastoral theology is that it begins with the lived experience of Black women. Therefore, as Watkins Ali demonstrates both the resistance of white male Protestant hegemony and the centering of African-American women, she writes, quote, it is essential that the perspective of poor Black women overshadow the paternalism left over from the modern era, which holds to the tradition that the pastor's experience offers the best view of the ministry context for theological reflection. And it is essential that the perspective of poor Black women outweigh the dominant European American cultural thought, which puts the concerns of the individual ahead of the concerns of the whole community, and overlooks the racism, sexism, and classism that is prevalent in American society. Finally, it is also the perspective of poor Black women that must also inform the character of ministry in the African-American context. So with this in mind, our conversant journey this evening will ultimately guide us to what Wiggins and Williams identify as a womanist approach to spiritual care that validates African-American women's experience as the crucible for pastoral care of both individuals and systems struggling under the burdens of oppression. I like to consider womanist pastoral theology as the mother of womanist pastoral and spiritual care. Womanist pastoral theology is the life force offering its methodologies and theoretical frameworks to the embodied practices of spiritual care. And one such offering is that of womanist pastoral theological sources. Womanist pastoral theology begins with the lived experience of African-American women and relies on creative, theological, sociocultural, and psychological sources to frame and articulate how spiritual care providers can listen to, interpret, and respond to the unique spiritual care needs of African-American women. This creative mix of sources both challenges traditional paradigms and offers new insights and strategies for caring for the Black woman's body and spirit. For example, Watkins Ali's womanist pastoral theological sources include Black women's lived experience, womanist theology, Black liberation theology, Black psychology, and African-American literature, namely the works of James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. And my womanist pastoral theological sources often include women's lived experience, womanist theology, liberation theology, Womanist and Mujerista psychology, and African-American literature. Across the works of womanist pastoral theology, you might note the use of similar sources, especially that of African-American fiction. And Watkins Ali notes that the African-American literary tradition is, quote, a resource for interpreting the psychological experience of African-Americans, end quote. And I argue that in addition to interpreting psychological experience as a source for womanist pastoral theology, African-American literature can offer us an ideal and transformative image of communal care and oppressive resistance rooted in the spiritual and intrapsychic experience of African-American authors and the characters that they create. So one of the most appreciated and cited pieces of African-American literature across womanist pastoral theology is Toni Morrison's Beloved. And this text, much like The Color Purple by Walker and Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, is regarded as a sacred text within the field of womanist theology. As such, it proves to be an invaluable source for womanist pastoral theology and thereby womanist spiritual care, as its characters portray the violent oppression experienced by African-American women, the resistance and resilience of African-American women in spite of oppression, and their capacity to provide remarkable spiritual care in a post-slavery society. In Beloved, set in 1873 Cincinnati, we meet the character Baby Suggs Holy, an ex-slave and the deceased mother-in-law of the text's main character, Celie. In the text, Celie recalls and invokes the mothering nurture and spiritual power of Baby Suggs Holy, who has died 9 years before the plot of the text takes place. Baby Suggs' death causes Celie and her daughter Denver to withdraw emotionally, physically, and spiritually from society, but over the course of various events, including the emergence of a daughter-like spirit or spirit-like daughter named Beloved, Celie reacquaints herself with the memory of Baby Suggs and shares this memory through story with her daughter Denver and with Beloved. Celie was always tormented by her life as a slave, by grotesque treatment such as mammary rape, and by the death of 3 of her children, one of whom she murdered herself in order for the child to avoid the life of slavery. And it was in Baby Suggs and eventually in the memory of Baby Suggs that Celie found healing. One day, as a way to invoke Baby Suggs' spirit, Celie decides to venture back to a clearing in the woods, a place described as, quote, where Baby Suggs had danced in sunlight, end quote. So you see, Baby Suggs Holy was a self-proclaimed preacher who would travel from pulpit to pulpit in the fall and winter months, preaching at AME churches, at Baptist churches, at holiness churches all across Cincinnati. But in the spring and summer, Baby Suggs would take her message outside to the clearing. Morrison writes that when warm weather came, Baby Suggs Holy, followed by every Black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing, a wide open place cut deep in the woods, nobody knew for what at the end of a path known only to deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while the people waited among the trees. And in the text, Morrison beautifully depicts what is now widely known as the sermon in the clearing, a sermon by none but Baby Suggs Holy herself, spoken to a community of ex-slaves, and a sermon I'd like to offer you this evening so that we may consider its contribution to womanist spiritual care. After situating herself on a huge flat-sided rock, Baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently. The company watched her from the trees. They knew she was ready when she put her stick down. Then she shouted, "Let the children come," and they ran from the trees toward her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. "Then let the grown men come," she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. Let your wives and your children see you dance, she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the women to her. Cry, she told them, for the living and the dead, just cry. And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way, laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced, men sat down and cried, children danced, women laughed, children cried until exhausted and riven. All and each lay about the clearing damp and gasping for breath. In the silence that followed, Baby Shug's Holy offered up to them her great big heart. She did not tell them to clean up their lives or to go and sin no more. She did not tell them they were the blessed of the earth, its inheriting meek or its glory bound pure. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, that if they could not see it, they would not have it. Here, she said, in this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it hard. Yonder, they do not love your flesh, they despise it. They don't love your eyes, they'd just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on your back, yonder they flay it. And oh, my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands, love them, raise them up and kiss them, touch others with them, pat them together, stroke them on your face, because they don't love that either. You got to love it, you. And no, they ain't in love with your mouth. Yonder out there, they will see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you scream from it, they do not hear. What you put into it to nourish your body, they will snatch away and give you leavings instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here, flesh that needs to be loved, feet that need to rest and to dance, backs that need support, shoulders that need arms, strong arms, I'm telling you. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me, they do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. So love your neck, put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts that they just as soon slop for hogs, you got to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it, love it. And the beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts, hear me now, love your heart, for this is the prize. Saying no more, she stood up then and danced with her twisted hip, the rest of what her heart had to say, while the others opened their mouths and gave her the music, long notes held until the four-part harmony was perfect enough for their deeply loved flesh. So as we see, Baby Shug's Holy works to facilitate healing and restoration for a community of ex-slaves through nature, worship, dance, and fellowship. Baby Shug's co-creates and facilitates a sacred space for Black bodies and Black spirits to find healing and self-love. She invites Black men, women, and children into the secrecy of the woods to allow their bodies and spirits the space to dance, to cry, and to laugh. This experience, this ritual, this spiritual care contributes to the healing of her community. Using Beloved as a source for womanist pastoral theology, as a source for womanist spiritual care, compels us to develop spiritual care practices that, as womanist pastoral theologian Stephanie Crumpton notes, allows us to, quote, work with Black women whose self-development in a historical context includes a legacy of bodies and spirits busted by institutionalized poverty, racism, and gendered violence, end quote. So gleaning from Baby Shug's sermon in the clearing, I would like to offer 5 practices of womanist spiritual care for those caring for African-American women. These practices are situated within third wave womanism, where the focus of womanist work is no longer focused on the identity of the care provider, like that of Walker's definition, but rather focused on the ideology of the care provider. Therefore, any person whose ideology aligns with the flourishing of African-American women and whose methods of spiritual care appreciate the fullness of spiritual expression of African-American women can adopt these practices of womanist spiritual care. The 5 approaches to care are what I term as relational practices of spiritual care that consider the importance of collaboration, connectivity, and relationship in the healing, coping, resistance, and resilience work of African-American women today. Because African-American women thrive within relational paradigms, trusting and mutualistic relationships between care providers and care receivers are critically important, especially within a society steeped in historical and contemporary injustice. Relational practices of spiritual care are womanist practices in that they take seriously the intersectional oppressive forces of racism, sexism, classism, and heterosexism impacting the lives of African-American women and their circles. Furthermore, these practices are womanist as they value the multi-generational power of African-American women surviving and thriving despite these intersectional oppressive forces apparent in their lives. In a theological sense, these practices are womanist in that they honor the role of spirit and spirituality working within the lives of African-American women, facilitating a long-lasting legacy of resilience and resistance. So these womanist practices of spiritual care include honoring resilience and resistance, believing lived experience, affirming full humanity, co-creating sacred spaces, and offering hospitality. First, honor resilience and resistance. CD contends that because slave life had busted Baby Shug's legs, back, head, eyes, hands, kidneys, womb, and tongue, she had nothing left to make a living with but her heart, which she put to work at once. Despite living her entire life as a slave, Baby Shug's found a way to live into resilience and resistance of the oppression she endured, and she shared that sense of resilience and resistance with her community. So we must not fall into the trap of relegating African-American women as victims. Despite a tumultuous and complex history, African-American women demonstrate a clear resistance to victimization and preparedness to engage with oppressive systems and society and survive. While the systemic injustices seeped deep into American society may call society to view African-American women as powerless victims treated as inferior within entire social systems, African-American women maintain a significant sense of resilience, collaborative resistance, and ability to make a way out of no way. Womanist religious scholar Nancy Lynn Westfield writes, for oppressed African-American women, resilience is about finding ways of living within one's context and understanding the context so well that one reconstitutes the self while in chaos, but not out of chaos, to see oneself in a positive light, while the world around would say the opposite. Resilience is the feeling of security, protection, and stability emerging from the midst of risk. Resilience is like a baby whose head and neck are held securely. Resilience is about mastering the terrain of the oppressive context so well that one recreates and heals the self in the very midst of chaos. It is mastering the ability to see oneself in a life-affirming light while the world around would shroud in her shadow. This sounds like Baby Shug's Holy and her work. Despite systemic injustice aiming to wreak havoc on their lives, their families, and their communities, generations of African-American women transcend such aims and create pathways to navigate society. Similar to resilience, resistance to social oppression is also an esteemed quality of African-American women. Womanist scholars Danielle Drake Burnett, Bravada Garrett Akinsanya, and Thema Bryant Davis write that from the times of enslavement, through the powerful struggles of the civil rights movement to modern day advances, the narratives of Black women have described creative resistance strategies that have moved them from places of pain to places of power. Despite systemic attempts to marginalize, devalue, and erase their existence, the socially constructed realities and lived experiences of Black women under oppressive conditions of exploitation and violence have yielded coping strategies that contribute to their resilience in the fight for social justice. Therefore, as a relational approach to spiritual care, womanist spiritual caregivers must honor the resilience and resistance of African-American women that have been practiced for generations. Next is to believe lived experience. In her sermon, Baby Suggs notes that out yonder, what Black folks say out of their mouths, society will not heed. And what Black folks scream from their mouths, society does not hear. Baby Suggs subverts this sentiment and affirms the lived experience of all whom she ministers to. As an ex-slave herself, she's acutely aware of the psychological, physical, and spiritual trauma endured by her community. And rather than question why members of the community experience internalized struggle, Baby Suggs instead affirms and believes their lived experience. This teaches us that African-American women's experiences must be unquestioned and trusted by their spiritual care providers in order to effectively establish positive caring relationships. Trust centers Black women as fully capable of accurately describing their own experiences, including physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual experiences. As Marsha Brown Foster Boyd describes in her work on womanist care, African-American women must be listened into life. Womanist spiritual caregivers harness the potential to subvert the persistent paradigm of not believing African-American women when they share about their struggles, and in turn, listen to, value, and affirm their experiences. Womanist spiritual caregivers can effectively call the African-American woman's narrative into the world by listening and empowering her to give voice to her own story. Once she tells her story, the spiritual caregiver must above all believe her. To believe the experiences of Black women, from the pain in her body to the pain in her spirit, is to acknowledge her as a competent woman imbued with the agency to tell her own story. This level of empowerment aligns the spiritual caregiver with the African-American woman, thereby developing and strengthening a therapeutic alliance. Next, affirm full humanity. In her sermon, Baby Suggs says, "Yonder they do not love your flesh, they despise it." Society viewed Black bodies as problematic, as unlovable, as other. Baby Suggs subverts this sentiment by affirming the full humanity of her community. Baby Suggs encourages her community to love the fullness of who they are. She encourages them not only to cry, to dance, and to laugh, but she encourages them to love their flesh, love their hands, love their mouths, their feet, and their unnoosed necks. Black feminist sociologist Patricia Hill Collins asserts that maintaining images of US Black women as the other provides ideological justification for race, gender, and class oppression. For Collins, there are various images evolving over time used to control how Black women are viewed within society. These controlling stereotypical tropes resourcefully relegate Black women as the other within American society and limit their full participation as dynamic human beings. To affirm the full humanity of African-American women, womanist spiritual caregivers must first release Black women from the prison of these controlling images within their own minds. Stereotypical tropes run rampant within society, and even spiritual care providers who identify as African-American women risk adhering to these harmful images due to persistent inundation within the systems they occupy. In addition to releasing the images of control and viewing African-American women as fully human with all of their complexities, womanist spiritual caregivers must work to challenge these controlling images within entire systems. Oftentimes, affirming full humanity within entire systems can look like advocacy. Womanist spiritual caregivers can advocate for African-American women by using their own institutional authority to call for just treatment, challenge or question oppressive policies and structures, and center systemic actions that promote wholeness and flourishing. Next, co-create ritual in sacred spaces. In Beloved, we see Baby Shugs facilitate a ritual for her community. Every Saturday in the warm weather months, she meets her community in the clearing, and Baby Shugs shows us that ritual for Black women and their families can look like crying, dancing, and laughing in a clearing in the woods. And today, ritual for Black women can look like the slow and steady hum of a spiritual or the rhythmic stirring of a gumbo pot. Ritual can look like girl talk with sister friends or being on the dance floor with hands on hips. Ritual for Black women happens in pews with hands clapping and amen shouting, or in whispered prayers, the call of an ancestor, or silent meditation. Ritual is an integral aspect of Black women's lives, and Womanist spiritual caregivers can assist in making space for rituals to take place. Womanist pastoral theologian Stephanie Crumpton describes ritual as that which binds together communities and spirit. I understand spirit to be a creative and wisdom-filled existential presence that exists all around and within Black women and their circles. Spirit is a holy, ancestral, and self-sustaining presence. All African-American women, regardless of religious or spiritual identity, have access to spirit and may benefit from the rituals that connect them, ultimately finding healing, rest, resistance, and resilience. Rituals binding Black women and spirit occur within sacred spaces such as a clearing in the woods, and co-creating sacred spaces for ritual requires communication and collaboration between the spiritual caregivers and the women they care for. African-American women and their circles of support must have the freedom to be fully authentic and encouraged to bring their whole selves and their spiritualities into the spaces in which they occupy. By bringing their full selves and the fullness of their spiritualities, mundane spaces become sacred and holy. Spirit dances with them, and ritual has room to perform. Finally, offer hospitality. Baby Shugs creates a space for Black folks to be authentically and unapologetically themselves. As her community awaits in the trees, Baby Shugs invites them with full hospitality into the clearing with just the movement of her stick. On hospitality within African-American women-centered spaces, womanist religious scholar Nancy Lynn Westfield writes that hospitality is a host's-friendly sharing of resources for the comfort of a guest. Of equal or greater importance, hospitality is a genuine, uninhibited sharing of self, spontaneous laughter, rest, reassurance, comfort, and familiarity. Hospitality is an attitude. Receiving hospitality reminds and reawakens women to love. The giving and receiving open and unbind women to experiences of grace. To receive hospitality, women exercise graciousness. African-American women value hospitality, acts and attitudes of comfort, welcome, and grace. Offering hospitality within an impressive society steeped in historical and contemporary injustice is a radical, subversive act of respect. The result of receiving hospitality is the invitation to be fully present without fear of mistreatment. Trust, collaboration, and receptiveness begin to take the place of uncertainty, suspicion, and self-protection. Womanist spiritual caregivers practice relationality in offering hospitality to African-American women and their circles. Hospitality looks like facilitating a sense of familiarity, safety, and reciprocity. Familiarity connotes a practical and holistic respect for an African-American woman's body, her body language, spoken vernacular, symbolism, and social perspectives. Safety involves providing space for African-American women to speak openly about their experiences and to offer their perspectives and worldview into the space without judgment or retribution. Reciprocity engages a mutualistic aspect of communication where the African-American woman is not the only vulnerable participant within the care encounter, but rather the spiritual caregiver offers a sense of vulnerability and self-disclosure as well. So each of these relational practices of spiritual care bring womanist spiritual caregivers and African-American women further into relationship and generates productive spiritual care within a society that may otherwise attempt to thwart flourishing. These relational practices attempt to mitigate the destruction of injustice and oppression and demonstrate a commitment to honor the power, resistance, and resiliency of African-American women in society. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, we see how the character of Baby Suggs Holy and her sermon in the clearing serves as a phenomenal source for womanist pastoral theology and thereby womanist pastoral and spiritual care. As Baby Suggs Holy stands in the center of the clearing, inviting her community to laugh, dance, and cry, to heal, love, and resist, she embodies the full potential of womanist spiritual care to facilitate African-American flourishing in society. And may we do the same. Thank you.